just before I begin, I am going to make sure I can see you all from my end. Okay. So today we are going to continue by looking at the Caribbean context. So we're still having this historical approach that seeks to do some clarification, but now we are going to look at the Caribbean element of this and how some of this is relevant to the region. So this session will look at some history. It will look at our civil society and civil society organizations new to the region. I'm sure you all probably have an idea about this. You can tell me at the end if your views and the one I presented here match up. Do Caribbean realities affect the applicability of generalized definitions of CSOs to the region? So, does the general concept of civil society organization make sense in the context of the Caribbean? How and how not, why and why not? You know, just to think about that a little bit. And then there's application again, which is very important when you are thinking about advocacy as well as about the legal elements of what this course offers. How and why the terms civil society are applicable to your work in a Caribbean context. This is really important to help you to start to clarify the kinds of messages you want to put forward and to think about the strategies you want to pursue. At least it is in my opinion. So here is my introduction. So I started off by answering that first question. And to answer that first question, I say that there is a long history of civil society organizations in the region. But when we consider the fact that this is a region that was thoroughly shaped by a system of colonization, which included slavery and indentureship, this has colored how civil society has emerged and functioned in the region. So to begin with then, when we think about that concept of civil society that we discussed last week as society, a lot of people were excluded from society because they were not even viewed as people, as proper humans. So we are talking about enslaved Africans in particular, but then there are also other people who were in some significant ways excluded, such as women, even women who were not enslaved. So that's something to think about when we consider how civil society organizations existed in the region and have evolved over time. And that takes us to the next point, which is that the evolution of civil society organizations in the region has been connected to race and class. And this is especially so in the colonial time period, but we can still see some of this today. So you may notice that different types of organizations have different classes of people, if we're being honest with ourselves. So for instance, the types of individuals who are members of a fisherfolk organization is very different from the type of organization of people who may be in organizations like the Lions Club or Kiwanis. And this is not to say that one group is better than another, but just to highlight some of these things and to note that these are not new developments. And perhaps they were more stark during the colonial time period. Also, the evolution of civil society organizations has been linked to social movements, both internal imperatives, so things that were happening in individual countries and in the region, and also external trends and demands. So there are things that are happening outside of our individual countries and outside of this region that have also influenced the type of civil society organizations that have been created and also the ways in which they have been structured. And this continues today as well. Even when we think about a course like this, a course like this is driven both by internal imperatives. These are things that you want to know, to learn about, and they're skills that you want to develop, but also by external trends and demands. So we have donor agencies that are interested in helping to build capacity in civil society organizations. So we'll start by looking at civility. Yes, do you have a question? No? And just to remind everyone, when you come into the discussion, please just enter your name and your organization in the chat so that we can document this properly. So let me continue. We're going to start by looking at civility and Caribbean civil society in historical context. This is a continuation of what we did last time when we talked about the civil in civil society. And in doing this, it helps us to develop an understanding of some of the exclusions that have historically existed in Caribbean civil society organizations and in Caribbean civil society. So this notion of civility has been key to civil society as a concept. And these are just two quotations here on the slide, one from Edwards and the other from Caldor, which point out the critical or the centrality of civility to this concept of civil society. So the first one says, civility from Aristotle to Stephen Carter assumes that we will disagree, often profoundly, but calls on us to resolve our disagreements peacefully. The next one says, civility is defined as not just good manners or polite society, but as a state of affairs where violence has been minimized as a way of organizing social relations. I really like the second one because they talk about violence being minimized as a way of organizing social relations, which is a bit more nuanced than saying that violence is in all places and at all times bad. Of course, we do not want to resort to violence, but sometimes situations end up being a bit ticklish, especially when there's excessive force that is used against people who really don't want to have any kind of violent protest or advocacy or action. And then I've also put this latter point, which speaks to the Marxist as well as Gramscian readings or understandings of civil society, which view civil society as bourgeois society. This is a noteworthy point because it sort of speaks to some of the exclusions and maybe the hierarchy within civil society as well as civil society organizations. And it speaks to the way in which conforming to some of these notions of civility really is bourgeois. And you can think about that in your own time, ask yourself questions about this, but it is quite interesting reading, especially when we consider the context of the Caribbean. And there's this little image that I have here that I just found on the internet that shows some things that people connect to civility: manners, courtesy, respect, very important, kindness, consideration. So when operating within civil society, we kind of expect these behaviors. And then there is the counter, the opposite, which is viewed as uncivil society. So now we can juxtapose this uncivil society with what we saw in the previous slide, where there are attempts to have violence characterize social organization and interactions, where violence is one of the principal means of carrying out certain actions. So civil society can be juxtaposed with uncivil society. And here we're talking about those with violent and often criminal intentions. And I think I did mention this in the last training session. And there's a quote here from Aimé Césaire in part, as well as from myself. And it talks about some of the reasons why the notion of civility can be problematic in our context. And it says, the notion of civility is problematic as it has historically been defined in ways that have delegitimized the activities of specific groups of people. In the colonial context of the Caribbean, this act of delegitimizing occurred in what Aimé Césaire termed two dishonest equations: Christianity equals civilization and paganism equals savagery. And we can think of a lot of examples of the ways in which the majorities of the population across the region have been excluded and their ways of organizing themselves that could be considered civil society and could be considered conducive to developing organizations and so on were really stifled in the colonial context. There were things such as banning association and organization across enslaved Africans. This is key to the functioning of civil society. Things like banning drumming that occurred in many parts of the region during the time period of slavery really were efforts to undermine the development of civil society across people who were enslaved. Yeah? And I developed this next here. The definition of civility has led to some problematic outcomes. For instance, we have the devaluation and delegitimization of peoples around the world during colonization, as I said, for instance, indigenous people. So we tend to talk a lot in the Caribbean about enslaved Africans, but also indigenous people were viewed as savage and uncivil. And therefore, they could be omitted from civil society, and they even could be omitted from civil treatment. Enslaved Africans as well, treated as chattel, right? So less than human, transformed into property. And property is not part of civil society. And we can extend some of this to even indentured laborers who, although they were not treated as chattels, they certainly were not viewed in the same way as those of European descent. And even across those of European descent, there was a kind of hierarchy as well. In a country like Barbados, for instance, where there's this notion of so-called poor whites, there was this kind of hierarchy where there was a lot of exclusion of people from civil society. And what we have is that by extension, the ways in which people from these ethnic groups, for instance, may have organized themselves, may have formed groups, and may have socialized and interacted were not viewed as civil. And this is really a value judgment. So what is uncivil about beating drums as one of the ways that you organize yourself, or paying tribute to the ancestors, for instance? Is this really uncivil? So because these groups, these people did not conform to certain notions of civility, civil society did not exist among them. And this is really something that is important, I think, for us to understand when we consider how civil society organizations have developed in the Caribbean context. So, are there any questions so far? No comments?
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, I'll continue. So this next slide, it has quite a bit of information on it, so I will give you a little time to look at it, as well as I won't go so fast when I'm speaking. So it says towing the line between civil and uncivil. And here I say that the treatment faced and conditions experienced by enslaved Africans were uncivil. And this was treatment that was meted out by the so-called civilized, right, civil society. And what you had as a result was that some people who were enslaved sought to redress this through resistance. And the thing is that much of the resistance, not all of the resistance that occurred from enslaved Africans was violent. There were instances of things like malingering, right? So working slowly and feigning illness and so on. But there was also, at times, there were riots, right, and rebellions. And there was debate within the abolitionist movement. So we had organizations in Britain and the United States that actually pursued the abolition of slavery. And there were debates within these movements about whether or not slave rebellions were right or wrong. Were they acceptable or unacceptable? Should they, as nice and civilized organizations that were doing petitions and writing letters, should they cry down rebellions and revolts as as unacceptable, or should they accept them as legitimate forms of civil society activity or civic activity? And there was a lot of discussion about this. Most of those within the abolitionist movement said that these were wrong. Yes, that slavery was wrong, but also responding to it with violence was wrong. And there are some questions that we can ask about this, because when we think about our history in the Caribbean, we mark these types of riots and rebellions as significant acts, even though they don't conform to our notions of what we should do within civil society. So by extension, we can look at other movements within the anti-slavery movement, the women's movement, anti-colonial movement, civil rights movement in the US and Britain, for instance, the labor movement and other movements, there have been nonviolent acts of resistance as well as organization that we accept as following the channels of civility, even when they're facing severely unjust situations. But there's also been the opposite. People who've thrown stones, been involved in vandalism, destroyed property, and so on. And we can ask questions about whether this was civil or uncivil. Yeah? So if we think about this, we can ask ourselves about the 1930s riots in the Caribbean, in the English-speaking Caribbean in particular. Were these civil or uncivil? Where do they fit in? So it kind of raises some questions. If anybody has been following the protests in Hong Kong over the last week or so, we have seen that these protests in Hong Kong against extradition, the protests have arisen against the requirement that some people from Hong Kong be extradited to China to face certain charges. And some of the backlash within society has come because there is a view that what happens in mainland China is quite undemocratic, and that Hong Kong wants to have more democratic options exercised, and therefore does not like to have people in Hong Kong don't want to have their country people extradited to China. And a lot of this has resulted in violence. So we can ask some questions about where this sits. And somebody did ask this question in the last class. And it's kind of difficult to unpick where exactly these types of actions sit, right? So that's the end of that segment where I give a little bit of historical context as to the Caribbean and some of, I guess, the contradictory forces that could have undermined the development of civil society and perhaps civil society organizations in the region. Yeah. Any comments or questions so far? No? All right, I will continue. Please, if you have a question or a comment at any point in time, feel free to ask, okay? This is your session. So next we are going to look at civil society organizations themselves. And I ask you here to excuse me because I cannot cover every single civil society organization or type of civil society organization that has existed. What I'm focusing on here are the ones that I have conducted some research on, and in particular the ones that have been more politically active and visible. So there are many more apolitical types of organizations that have not come up on my radar and are a lot more difficult to find information on because of the fact that they tend to be less political. So that's just a little caveat there. So I will start with some of those that existed in the 18th century into the 19th century. So here we can find commercial associations as well as agricultural ones. And this is not surprising in some ways because in this time, if you think about the discussion that I just provided about who was able and acceptable to participate in civil society, we basically have this elite of planters and merchants in particular living in the Caribbean or West Indies as it would have then been called. So it's not surprising that the types of organizations that we see emerging represent the interests of these groups of people. So we have commercial associations in the Bahamas, Jamaica, and later Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago. These basically represented the interests of merchants. And agricultural societies, and I have some of the places that they were listed. This is more so in the 19th century now. And what you can see is that these agricultural societies tended to emerge post-emancipation. And these two sets of groups tended to be, or tend to be predecessors of chambers of commerce and agricultural societies that exist today or that have existed into the 20th century and beyond. These were elite male organizations. Probably weren't going to find women in these. Pretty much white organizations. So we see the effects of colonization as well as the race and class dynamic kind of influencing the sorts of organizations that we can easily find out about that existed during the 18th and 19th century. If we look following emancipation, in addition to the agricultural societies, we start to see the ballooning or the increase in number of welfare type groups among formerly enslaved people. So friendly societies, burial societies, credit associations, and some women's groups, like self-help organizations here is what we are talking about. And again, we see this kind of race-class dynamic in that these organizations were populated by people who were predominantly non-white. And this is all, these notions of race are quite fluid. So I'm not talking about racial purity in any way, but in the way in which we in the Caribbean think about who is white and who is not, who is brown and so on. But anyway, predominantly non-white people from lower classes in society comprised these groups. So you see a level of stratification within civil society organizations at this time. Then we also have church, religious associations, and charitable associations across the region. And often these organizations were founded because if you think about the context of the post-emancipation time period, we did not have social welfare systems that people could fall back on if they required some assistance. And coming out of slavery with emancipation, people often were living in really difficult conditions, in a lot of poverty. So a lot of these charitable organizations attempted to do what they could to address some of these situations. So this is kind of a continuation of what we see a lot of organizations doing today as well. They provided services, they provided a level of relief. And some of them, including the religious associations, may have provided education along with some of this relief. But then the education was clearly a certain type of education, right? A Christian education. What is also notable here is that within these charitable organizations, we can see the class stratification again. They were often run by, not always, but you could see the presence of women in these organizations, especially those from the middle class who were viewed as white or colored, right? So not people who were too black, for instance. Probably those who may have achieved their freedom, before the emancipation of slaves, before the end of slavery. And what is interesting is that this was an acceptable form of work for these types of women and was often viewed as a status symbol as well. That you could become involved in charitable work meant that you were of a certain stature in your country, that you did not require the receipt of what these charitable organizations were doling out. Yeah, so you were in a position of privilege. So we can see some of the class stratification within civil society organizations at this time. Moving into the 20th century, and as I said before, there are a lot of organizations and types of organizations that I have omitted. But I just want to give you an idea of some of the types of organizations that existed and that may have been significant in Caribbean societies. One of the most significant types of civil society organizations that emerged in the Caribbean region by the 20th century were workers' organizations, or what today we think about as we call trade unions or labor unions. And these started to emerge in the 19th century and continue to do so into the 20th century. But these often did not use the term union. They talk about working men's association or association of different people. And this is because of the legal context at the time period, which is that in much of the region, unions, as we think about them today, were not legal. So that's just a point to note. And I've listed here on this slide some of the examples of the unions that began to emerge in Jamaica, Trinidad. We have the Trinidad Working Men's Association, Guyana, and very important here is this point here. the fifth bullet point. What we see is with the growth of unions and working men's associations across the region, we have the development of a regional organization. So we have the British Guiana and West Indies Labour Congress. This is a meeting that is held, and the Congress continues to function. That was established in 1926. So this was a meeting of various unions and working men's associations across the region. And this eventually developed into the Caribbean Labour Congress, established in 1945, and that is the predecessor of what today we call the Caribbean Conference of Labour, Congress of Labour. And again, we can see the class relations and inequalities are evident in this. People who were involved in these unions were usually from the lower classes, not exclusively, some middle class membership as well, in society that were looking for greater access to rights for the working masses of Caribbean populations. And here I would like to focus on a case study that uses the regional labor movement. So this labor movement provides a really interesting and noteworthy example of mobilization. This mobilization was not just for working conditions. Today, when we think about unions, we think about unions talking about industrial policy. What is happening in a certain organization? People want a pay raise. Some people in a specific organization may not be happy with the conditions of their labor in that particular organization or in the public sector and so on. But when we think about the early up to the mid 20th century, the regional labor movement mobilized for things that were beyond the really narrow workers' rights in individual organizations. And they were mobilizing for improvements in people's living conditions as well as working conditions, in addition to self-governance in the region. And what we see here is networking. Networking was important even at this time period. So although today we think about, we live in a network society where we're increasingly connected through technology and that we can use this networking capacity to do our work in various organizations, we also saw this even in the early 20th century, not using social media and the internet and so on. But this networking really was important. And it was not just important for growing awareness and growing a movement and activities and organizations that supported this movement, but also for attempting to influence policy. So delegates from the British Guiana and West Indies Labour Congress were invited to make contribution to the Moyne Commission. So the Moyne Commission, do y'all know about the Moyne Commission? Or maybe I should ask, does anybody not know about the Moyne Commission? Okay, everybody knows about it. So the Moyne Commission, somebody has a question in the chat. Oh, somebody's, okay, so this is Garisha says that this just goes to show that there's power in unity. It's true. So the Moyne Commission was tasked with examining the conditions in the West Indies, the British West Indies, following these riots that occurred across the region in the 1930s, and with an eye to improving these conditions so that you could avoid these kinds of riots and unrest, going forward. So the British Guiana and West Indies Labour Congress was able to make submissions and to provide their perspectives on the types of changes that were required in the region to improve the conditions of working people and the masses in general. This is quite significant. Yeah. We can also see the Caribbean Labour Congress, which came after the British Guiana and West Indies Labour Congress, also drafted a bill to influence the creation of a federal constitution when there were talks that were ongoing in the British West Indies about the creation of a West Indian Federation. So they again tried to write out what it is they expected, not just to talk about it, not just to hold meetings and rallies and talk amongst themselves, but to provide something in writing and concrete to decision makers to try and influence how the British West Indian Federation would be structured. That said, now I stick a pin here, right? So they did a lot of these things which were wonderful. If you do some in-depth research into the British West Indies Federation, what you will see is that several of their suggestions were ignored or put on the back burner because they were viewed as contentious. One of these was free movement of labor. And this still is a very ticklish issue in regional integration in the Caribbean. But one of the ideas that they had was to allow people to move to address the unemployment problems that existed by locking people into very small locales or territories in the region. Yeah? And they also had some more radical ideas about how the federation should work than the political directorate that actually ran the federation for the brief period that it existed. So that's just a little case study that helps us to think a bit about how civil society organizations have mobilized and structured their advocacy at different points in time. Yeah? Comments or questions? Okay, I will move on. I have some other examples. This next one is the United Negroes Improvement Association, UNEA. I don't know if you all have heard of this one. I hope you have. And this is an organization founded by Marcus Garvey in Jamaica in 1914. It had branches across the region, as well as in the United States and some parts of South America. And it was more radical in its calls for Black consciousness. And again, what we can see here is that even though there are things that have emerged in, let's say, one particular country, it is not uncommon for civil society organizations or movements to spread beyond a particular territorial location. And we see this in a kind of Garveyite movement that emerged. Although for some people, this is a contentious movement. We also had in the region representative government associations, and these were created throughout the Eastern Caribbean to address the lack of access to political processes that the majority of the population in the region again had. So if we look at the race, class, color kind of dynamic, these tended to emerge from so-called colored or brown people, white brown, whatever term people like to use, middle class people, an emerging middle class that sought representation because they were mostly excluded from these processes. And they also were able to gain working class support in their demonstrations, meetings, petitions, and so on. So what we can see here is that these civil society organizations mobilized to address conditions that were prevalent in the time period in which they existed. Yes, Latoya? You have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I was trying not to break your train of thought, but my question would be, does the kind of networking that would have happened like in the labor movement in Garvey's time, does that still happen in the region? And the reason I'm asking is because I think now a lot of civil society organizations are more about their cause more than for example a Caribbean-wide effort. And also because there's so little, I suppose, funding, or at least so fewer resources than there probably used to be, with an increase in the types of groups and each group having its own, I suppose, mandate. But I'm trying to figure out if within your research, if you've seen any kind of continuous networking in any of the areas outside of perhaps the labor unions.
Right. That's a great question. Thank you. What I would say is there is networking. And it seems kind of odd sometimes to me when I hear some comments from people in individual civil society organizations talking about the challenges of networking, because there is this other narrative when you read about technology and the digital age and all of the things that technology is supposed to offer that says that networking should be even easier for us today, and it is lower cost because you don't have to as they would have done then. You don't have to get on a boat and go somewhere. They're not even getting on a plane most of the time in these associations that I was talking about. So you can WhatsApp call and Skype and set up meetings like this one and create email groups and online campaigns and so on using the virtual. But I think there still are some significant questions about maybe the quality of networking that you get when you are just pursuing an online strategy. And I think there are ways in which we can look back at some of these types of activities and draw lessons. So the kind of question that you ask really begs a question about, are there things that in the 21st century we have let go of in the region and perhaps even in our individual countries that we may need to focus some of our efforts on in our advocacy and mobilization strategies? So building connections with other organizations. Anil is saying he believes the challenge with networking is personality differences and competition. That is true, and I think this exists in every organizational context. But then there are also questions about how can you bridge these, if it is possible to bridge these towards the end of whatever your cause is or the issue that you are working on. So I think these are really things for us to go back and reflect on and to ask, if there has been a weakening of this networking, is this a bad thing or a good thing? How can it be revived and how can we make functioning networking? Yeah. So really think about some of these things. Even in this training, this is an opportunity where you can do some networking with people from different organizations in different parts of the region, in your own country as well, and see what you can gain from that. Yeah? Are there any other questions or comments? No? Okay, I will move on. You're welcome, Latoya. I have another case study of policy advocacy. And this one uses two types of entities. On the one hand, we have business representative organizations, and on the other, we have those who are, I guess, viewed as academia or researchers. Not all of them were formerly in the UWA. So here I have the ICCC. Did I clarify what that acronym was previously? No, so I'm gonna have to just make an adjustment to your note to clarify what that is. And that's the Incorporated Chamber of Commerce, in the Caribbean. And what this group did, again, this is a regional group of chambers of commerce that existed in the 1960s. And they created a committee that toured the region to speak with heads of government, to get their opinions and to try and encourage them to see their perspectives on creating a regional free trade agreement. So their strategy was to move across the region. They formed this committee and moved across the region to try and test the ideas to see what would be possible in the heads of politicians, as well as to let them know where their interests lay. And in August 1967, this group was able to attend an inter-territory meeting in Georgetown, Guyana to present their proposals for a free trade agreement for what would become CARIFTA. We also had another very vocal group in the region called the New World Group, which existed in the 60s and 70s, formed of academics who worked at the University of the West Indies, but also other people that were just independently thinking about different things, involved in literature and various areas in society. Were involved in New World Group, and they also submitted proposals, and some of these proposals were presented at this meeting about CARIFTA. So their proposals were quite different from those coming from the Chambers of Commerce. They talked about things like having regionally integrated industry and like designating individual countries to produce certain things. And a very different approach from what is a conventional free trade area, which means goods and services should be able to move freely across the region. We saw similar types of advocacy from the Caribbean Association of Industry and Commerce. This is the organization that followed the ICCC, which sought to influence, again, the direction of CARICOM. And so much so that it offered some funding and assistance in setting up a Caribbean investment fund is what it was called at that time, to do some redistribution of the profits that would have been gained from the so-called more developed countries, the larger or more profitable countries or industries in the Caribbean to other parts of the region. So again, we can see some of these regional strategies that attempt to influence policy processes. What's interesting about the two of these is that on the one hand, when we look at the business representative organizations, they are more formalized entities, as opposed to the New World Group, which was more of just a group of people that had similar ideas and sought to develop these ideas and discuss them. So this was a less formalized type of entity within civil society. Yeah. So I'm trying to leave you all with some hope, right? That civil society organizations can attempt to influence policy processes, and they can make it through the door if they organize themselves appropriately and if they're able to reach important individuals or groups in decision-making processes. And what we see from the New World Group, for instance, is that you don't necessarily have to have a structured organization. I mean, it did help in some ways that these were a lot of intellectual people who may have had a certain level of social standing. But there are different avenues to try and influence policy processes. Any questions on this case study? And just when you're thinking about this in your own time, I want you to ask yourself, what about this is applicable to our current situation, and what lessons can I learn from this in thinking about an advocacy strategy? All right, and here we come to more of the present, at least more of the present for me. I don't know how many people in here were alive in the late 20th century. Maybe many of you, especially from the youth groups, are only alive in the 21st century, I don't know. But the late 20th century, CSOs in the late 20th century into the 21st century. And I start by saying that there's kind of a myth that says that women's organizations really ballooned and began to exist in around the 1970s, 60s, 1970s in the region, in line with the women's movement, the second wave of the women's movement in the USA and Britain and so on. This is not fully accurate. There have been many women's organizations in the region, some of them loose, some more formalized. And I have some examples here, those that spoke to bringing the right to vote for women and participation in political parties, such as the League of Women's Voters in Jamaica and the Women's Political and Educational Organization in Guyana. These existed in the 1940s. We also had welfare type organizations, those concerned with personal and moral improvement as well. YWCA, mothers' unions, there were lots of types of women's organizations that existed, some of them quite apolitical, many of them service delivery oriented, but then we also had those of the more political kind of bent. Even within UNIA, the United Negroes Improvement Association, there was a very vocal women's wing as well that spoke not just about unity for Black people and improvement of conditions for Black people, but also of women within this movement, and not just in the region, in the world. And by 1970, we have the creation of an umbrella association in the region, the Caribbean Women's Association in the 1970s. So some of the things that this narrative should show you is that we have different types of dynamics. On the one hand, we tend to have organizations and entities that have emerged at the community level and domestic level, but at times we've also seen them coming together to form umbrella associations. So by umbrella association, I mean an association of associations, perhaps at the national level or at the regional level, or sometimes to form regional organizations, which I would say is a lot rarer in the Caribbean. Most of the regional organizations that we have are umbrella associations. So those are associations of associations. The members are other associations rather than private individuals. We also have by the 1990s, new types of organizations emerging, types of organizations that maybe were unheard of in the 40s and 50s, like environmental organizations, those dealing with gender and sexuality issues, LGBTQ+. These letters did not mean anything to people in the 1940s or in the 19th century, right? Health concerns, youth concerns. We even have organizations emerging that address technology and the internet. And the internet is not something that existed in the time period I was talking about previously. So we have these new types of organizations emerging, very much in line with both internal dictates and occurrences, as well as wider global trends and occurrences as well. So what happens in the Caribbean certainly does not happen in isolation. It's not just responsive to community or national needs, but also responds to wider global trends as a consequence of the way in which the Caribbean is inserted or exists in the world. We also have many professional, cultural, sporting, social, and recreational organizations that have long existed in the region and that continue to exist and to be developed across the region. We have the continuation and kind of the multiplication of industry-oriented or business representative organizations. So you have small business organizations or associations emerging. These did not really exist in the 19th century. And there are different types of professional associations that come to exist as well. And as I said, these operate variously at the community, national, and regional level. And sometimes the organizations are connected to broader global or international organizations or associations as well. So even umbrella associations at the international level. So, how is this relevant to me, to you, to us? Here are some points that I just noted that you may want to consider, and I have been trying to make these clear as I went along, and we are just coming up to time, so you know that I'm soon going to end. So, one of the points is that social movements have been important in the region, both internally and externally driven. So, we can view social movements as, there's some social movements that we can view as having emerged within the region, such as the labor movement or an anti-slavery movement. But even when we think about these, in some ways they were connected to externally driven movements, because you had an abolitionist movement outside of the region and also a labor movement outside of the region. In France and Britain in the 1920s and 1930s, we do have the emergence of quite strong labor movements, and very critical in Britain. For those of us in here, I believe most of us in here are from the so-called English-speaking Caribbean. We have the emergence of a labor government, right? So there are also some externally driven elements of social movements that have been important in understanding changes in Caribbean civil society and in civil society organizations. And we can think about this also when we consider women's movement. The 1970s in particular, we have a decade for women, the Black Power movement. We can think about things such as reparations, environmental movement, LGBT+, Q+, and so on. So all of these are in some ways, they gain some momentum from other things. This is not to say that all organizations work in this way, but some of the ones that are quite policy active have kind of drawn on wider movements within civil society, youth movement. Yeah. Even when we look at the organizations that deal with health issues, we can see today this emphasis on NCDs, non-communicable diseases, and we can perhaps connect some of the successes, or at least the voice that organizations that work to deal with diabetes or cancer, for instance, may have today that they may not have had previously when the topic of NCDs was not so fashionable. What we also see is that civil society organizations can institutionalize elements of these movements, and this can be useful for having structured advocacy strategies. So a lot of times you have a movement, You have people on the streets in Puerto Rico, people on the streets in Hong Kong. But then after all of the protests and so on, what happens? So you want something, you want an individual removed from government or a government removed altogether. But what happens at the end of that? And what we see is that civil society organizations in institutionalizing elements of these movements can allow for sustained advocacy strategies. They can try to influence legislation and create, not just to allow for people to create laws or policies to respond to these organizations or to these movements, but to create the types of laws and policies that people who are working in these organizations think address the concerns appropriately. Yeah. On the other hand, we can see that some of the ways in which these civil society organizations have been institutionalized have been, I guess, externally driven, and some might say this is not necessarily a good thing. So the second big bullet point I have here, the sub-point, says that following labor uprisings in the 1930s, there was tutelage in unionism by the British. And there were pamphlets and so on. If you all do some archival research, you can see some of the pamphlets that come from Britain to help to shape how unions are formed and structured, and how they're supposed to have a general secretary and so on in the region, and how they're supposed to relate to businesses, for instance. Yeah, so to structure industrial relations. And this might be viewed as a good thing in helping them to have the institutional form that allows them to advocate and influence policy, perhaps, and also to get the kinds of outcomes that they need for labor. But we can also raise some questions about whether this external assistance in institutionalization may have had some negative consequences on the development of indigenous types of organizations. So this last point here that I asked, are there any pitfalls to some of this institutionalization, and perhaps some of the ways in which there's a level of tutelage from external sources, whether it is overt, as in the case of the 1930s, or less overt, in that NGOs today, when they form, may try to follow practices that they've seen other places or that they view as international best practice. There are benefits to this, but there are questions that can also be asked about having things that are indigenous and responsive to the particular country, community, context in which organizations exist. And this is the last slide. Other points to consider: the policy context. So the policy context has shaped how civil society organizations have functioned and expectations of civil society organizations. So for instance, things have changed dramatically in this world from the 18th century, where I started my timeline. So following the 1990s in particular, there's been a lot of policy emphasis on good governance. And this emphasis on good governance has highlighted the role that civil society organizations should play in governance, and therefore has raised the profile of civil society organizations, and in some ways has asked that these organizations kind of professionalize themselves so that they can participate in governance processes. Civil society organizations were viewed as having a role in democratization movements in the 1980s and 90s, and even thereafter. Movements, not just organizations, wider movements. So whether we're talking about the fall of the Soviet Union, or the so-called third wave of democratization across Africa and South America, or the Arab Spring, we see this role of civil society in democratization. And this has really influenced even our use of this terminology of civil society. The re-emergence of the term civil society and civil society organizations now is really a byproduct of this. Civil society organizations have also gained larger roles as donor aid recipients. And part of this is connected to good governance as well, because there were several accusations about the misappropriation of donor funds, and civil society organizations, NGOs, especially international non-governmental organizations, have been used to channel donor funds into communities and countries in ways that are viewed as less corrupt than the conventional channeling of donor funds exclusively through government. And this again has required this last point, the professionalization of civil society organizations so that they can even do this, so that you can accept funds and you can put in place whatever program you're accepting these funds for. You have to have a level of professionalism, you have to have accounting standards and internal governance structures and so on to take the people's donor aid and use it towards whatever end. Okay, Erica has to leave, but she reminds everyone of the mentoring session at 6 p.m. this evening for her mentees. I'm almost finished here. The legal context, I'm going to continue now. The legal context in which the region operates has not kept pace with changes in civil society organizations, so in this sector. And this is, for instance, in Guyana, organizations have to register using, I think it's called the Friendly Societies Act, but not all civil society organizations are friendly societies. In Barbados, you can register as a not-for-profit company or as a charity. This context does not really fit organizations, all types of organizations very well. And the Caribbean Policy Development Center has actually done some research on this and has even began to do some advocacy on creating better legislation for the sector. But how can organizations in the region work around this? So in your work, in creating a media strategy and an advocacy strategy and understanding the legal context, how can you work with this or around this? And these are things that you really may need to think about as well. And some of this may also include making some demands on the state to have legislation perhaps that allows you to function better. Final point, the advocacy strategies used before the 21st century are not necessarily wholly relevant today. We may need to reconsider them. Now, this does not mean that all of the old advocacy strategies were useless. As we mentioned previously, networking is very useful. Having some things that are concrete, perhaps written down or documented to provide to those in positions of influence who can make decisions is useful. But what about the world that we live in today, in which there's a lot of noise in social media and the internet? How can these technologies be harnessed to the benefit of your organizations and effectively, so that you don't just join the chatter and the noise that exists on the internet, but so that you are strategically influencing those that you want to influence, whether this is the wider population or policymakers or some combination. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of what I had to say for today. Right, thank you. In Guyana, NGOs can register with friendly societies, trusts, or a company. And again, thank you for that point, Valini, I believe it is. But I think the point is pretty much the same, right? Which is that civil society organizations are more than that. Friendly society, a trust, or a company. So a lot of our legislation has not kept up with the fact that there is a sector out there in which community-based organizations, NGOs, and other types of CSOs exist. And they've not really created the type of legislation that addresses how these function adequately, even in terms of, y'all will discuss some of this later, but in terms of things like taxation and duty-free exemptions and the sorts of things that you may need when you operate in the nonprofit sector. A lot of the legislation does not address these adequately, and sometimes even the process of registering formally can be quite onerous for voluntary organizations. But thank you for that point. Are there any questions or comments right now? Please feel free.
All right, Leroy here from SOGDA. Just a question on the funding. If we can jump back to the networking, back in terms of the networking, I had something written down here for funding, networking, and policy advocacy coordination. for NGOs to really effectively engage in that, funding is a critical part. And for most organizations in the region, that's, we basically survive project by project by project. So if you can maybe just briefly describe how were the CSOs, the regional CSOs in the 50s were able to, or even going into the Carifta and going into CARICOM, how were they able to coordinate, and sustain funding?
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, in very informal ways, out of pocket mostly. So they were not getting donor funding or project funding, often very informally with assistance from other people who were involved in the cause or believed that this was worthwhile. And a lot of it was self-funded. In some of these more, I guess, middle-class types of organizations, people were able to use their own resources to do this networking. So in a lot of ways, it really has been a labor of love and commitment that people have not become rich off of. They expense themselves in these activities. I think today, one of the things that civil society organizations have to think about is how you can fund these types of activities so that you can keep up the level of involvement that you need without people feeling burnt out or run down for no money and with no resources to conduct these kinds of activities. So I think it is a little bit difficult to compare this time period to that one because it really was a very different world. Yeah. And I mean, even the pace of life and the demands in the types of societies we live in today are quite different from in the 1940s or the 1920s. Even things like the cost of travel were quite different. So I don't have an easy answer. I would say you have to reflect on this and think about in your planning how you can access funding or how you can perhaps build funds specifically for this. So when you're thinking about, I know organizations work on a project-by-project basis, but are there ways that you can build into whatever strategy you have for fundraising funds towards networking and travel if that is required, and not just towards your day-to-day kinds of hands-on activity, because networking may very well be an important part of what you do. And if it is, you may need to think about, and I know it's difficult, but think about how you can strategize towards having some pool of funds available for that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you too. Any other questions or comments? We are out of time, but if anybody else has a comment or question, I'm happy to take it. No? Okay, thank you all for your participation. Remember, we have a tutorial that is on the 15th. I would like to have it in the evening, if that works for people, perhaps around 6 o'clock, but I will post that to you all. And evenings are better, great. So I would like to have that in the evening. And what I would say to you is if there is anything, when you watch these over, when you go through the notes, if there is anything that comes to mind that you want to discuss, that you want further clarification on, bring this to the tutorial session where we have a whole hour where we can talk. Yes? So thank you very much for your participation. Have a wonderful afternoon, and I look forward to meeting you all again on the 15th.
Thank you as well. Have a good evening.
All right. Bye-bye.